Greenhouse People. As always, I'm your host, Bill Calkins, and like I try to remind you every time, we are pleased to offer this discussion in video and podcast formats. My guest today is back to share more tips and tricks. Dr. Will Healy is our favorite recently retired technical manager from Ball Seed, who's here today to talk tomatoes, specifically how to finish the #1 vegetable crop for home gardeners. This is part of our Tech on Demand series covering key annuals and perennials and vegetables commercially produced around the world. I honestly don't think Will and I have ever talked about edible plants before, on video at least.
Nope.
I mean, maybe we talked peppers, but I think that was a while ago. Can you think of any? I don't think we've talked vegetables.
Only when we talk about at-risk crops.
That's true. Will's joining me to share advice for you and your team when growing out tomato plants and sending them to retail. If you like this installment, be sure to subscribe to the Tech on Demand podcast on your favorite app and find dozens of Tech on Demand videos on the Ball Seed YouTube channel. But Will, welcome back to Tech on Demand. And why exactly did you add tomatoes to your list of crops to discuss in our finished plant series?
Well, I think everyone has to say, really? Tomatoes? We've been doing this since kindergarten, growing tomatoes on the windowsill for Mom for Mother's Day, right? If it wasn't a tomato, it was a marigold. That's kind of what people took home for Mom for Mother's Day. But, tomatoes are one of those crops that I think a lot of people struggle with, but they just kind of do it and go on. So what I really wanted to do today is I really wanted to talk about growing high quality tomato transplants. There's that company out there that really has perfected your tomato production for young plants or for consumers. And that's your competition. How do you grow a nice, compact, good performing variety of tomatoes? So that's what we have to be looking at so that we can differentiate our tomato from at retail compared to the box store, which is basically slamming tomatoes out there by the gazillions. So, and there are tricks and things that you can do, because the beauty of tomatoes is there are an amazing number of varieties out there, almost too many in some ways, but it allows you to specialize as an independent garden center in being the tomato king or queen or specialist, depending on how you want to market yourself. And that's what will drive people in, because people love tomatoes. They love growing tomatoes. So that's what we want to do today. So let's get into this, Bill.
Let's go.
And start talking about it. And of course, like all of our crops, we want to get these things planted immediately upon arrival. One of the problems that you run into is if you hold tomatoes too long, you can get all kinds of disease issues. You can end up with stretching, you have poor quality, and then that all impacts the consumer's performance and happiness. And that's what we're really trying to do, is make them happy about growing tomatoes. So we really don't want to be holding those plugs. We really want to be basically bring them in, transplant them, and move them right straight through. You don't want root-bound plugs because they don't root out. If they don't root out, they don't take up nutrients. If they don't take up nutrients, we're just not going to get the growth. You really want to be very careful when you bring your plugs in that you just don't, you tinkle water right at the top and keep the upper surface wet, because that will cause this root wrapping, this circling of the root system at the top of the plug. You want to make sure that you dry them down. Tomatoes are really drought tolerant, so you can dry them down, maybe not so that they wilt and fall over and hit the dirt, but you want to basically get them so that they have a little bit of a limpy leaf to them before you water them back up. And you don't want to flood them, because then that's too much water and then they'll start stretching on you, especially in the young plant stage. So if you've got to hold them, you want to basically hold them at 50 to 60 degrees. They are somewhat warm-blooded. Do not get them too cold, or that causes a lot of other problems. And keep it less than 70 degrees day temperatures to minimize stretching. Now, if you've got your plugs that are stretched because you've held them, or they're basically, the beauty of tomatoes, and one of the critical things on tomatoes, is you got to plant them deep. Far too often I see growers that they plant the plug right on the surface of the soil, and they're losing the opportunity to get a really big root mass rapidly. You want to basically plant them at least down to the first true leaf, so that first true leaf is sitting at the top of the soil, because that hypocotyl, that stem that below the first true leaf, basically gives you the chance to really get some nice root growth faster so that you can sell them. And then it also gives the consumer much better performance. Planting them deep is always a good thing because my grandmother always told me plant those tomatoes nice and deep. Okay, look at water the plugs before you plant them. It's very important. And you may want to be, if you're going to fertilize them, look at fertilizing them with potassium nitrate, just a straight potassium nitrate. The reason for that is that you're going to get the promoted rapid growth from the nitrate without putting the ammonia and phosphorus, which is just going to cause them to stretch. So, but get that nitrogen in there so that they do grow nicely. If planting immediately, you want to basically put about 200 parts per million on them before you transplant them. If you're going to have to hold them, you basically have to hold them for a couple days without any feed, and then put a little bit heavier feed of 300 parts per million on them just before they go up on the transplant line. If you have to hold them for 7+ days or longer just because you've backed up or whatever reason, there's a lot of reasons why, make sure that you're feeding them with 50 to 75 parts per million to prevent the fertilizer stretch, and then make sure that you put on that 200 parts per million at the time of planting. Remember, things like 14014, 15015, where that middle number is 0, means there's no phosphorus. If there's no phosphorus, you're not going to get the stretch. You're going to get the nitrogen benefit without the stretch, which is what we're looking for. So basically, that's what we're trying to do, is get some feed in them so that they don't basically stall out after planting, so that you plant them and they take off and grow. You can use a wide range of containers for success with tomatoes. And of course, that dramatically impacts the crop time. So that the smaller containers, the quick crop time, basically 2 to 3 weeks during the late season, 3 to 4 early seasons. All you're trying to do is just get them rooted out, rooted down, so that you've got a root ball. So you get a little bit bigger container, 18 to 32 count. You may want to add 1 to 2 weeks. If you're starting to use larger pots, you just have to use more plants. Now, one of the things that I've done is that I've gone and put multiple plugs, especially if you're using like cherry tomatoes, get a couple different cherry tomatoes and put them into the same pot, because consumers like mixes, whether it's flower mixes or even vegetable mixes. So, and tomatoes are a perfect example, where if you have like 3 or 4 different cherry tomatoes that you put into the same pot, it gives them something a little bit different that sets you apart from everyone else. If you're trying to sell with visible fruit, you need to add about 4 to 6 weeks to get the green compared to doing a green plant crop time. So if you need fruit on them, make sure to just add more crop time so that you can, and then of course you have to stake them. A good soil is critical. The media will dictate whether you're going to have success or failure. Keeping that about 70% peat, and then using bulking agent like hydrofiber or wood fiber or bark or coconut fiber or whatever you're using, that basically helps get the cost down without affecting shelf life. As you start reducing the amount of peat, you change the drying pattern, the nutrient holding pattern of that crop. And so therefore you run into problems at retail and then for the consumer if they hold it at any time. Always test the soil before you start. Having a pH of 6 to 6.5, I've noticed this is a little higher than we normally want. So we can have a higher pH because tomatoes are pH suppressing crop. Make sure that you've got the EC checked, so that you're not putting it on with too hot, or if it's really low, that you adjust your initial feed to adjust for the fact that there's nothing in that soil. Every year we run into problems where people plant at the same time from the same plug tray, and they end up with the scenario like we see in this picture, where some of the plants look like they're a week to 2 weeks behind the rest of them. That has to do with the fact that those stunted plants are from old soil. They're from last year's soil. Last year's soil, the starter charge, the nutrient, the wetting agent are probably gone. It doesn't last forever. It's probably gone. And so therefore the plants are not going to respond. You're going to have to put a little bit of wetting agent to get the soil wet. You're going to have to put a little bit more feed on them just to get the plants up and running. So really make sure that if you've got old soil, put that old soil in large containers in the bottom of the pot and put some fresh soil on top, and then you won't have any problems. But don't use the old soil in especially small containers like packs and small pots. When we think about what the consumer is buying, the consumer is buying the top. They look at it and they say, "This looks good." For what consumers are buying, how to achieve that is what growers are doing. They're producing roots. So the growers are responsible for getting those roots on them, because with the roots, you can get the fertilizer on, and to get the best roots, you need to manage your moisture. So when we start thinking about how do we grow high quality plants, we really need to be thinking about what is our moisture and fertilizer program so we can grow great roots, which will then yield you excellent tops. As we always say, fish grow in water, roots grow in air. Anytime you have a situation where you keep the plants too wet, they're going to stretch, they're going to be soft, they're going to be susceptible to all types of diseases. So, especially with tomatoes, which are highly sensitive to a lot of different diseases, you want to make sure that you're actually getting them to dry. Moisture management is your number one issue with growing high quality tomatoes. Make sure that you're aware that they're highly responsive to moisture. Keeping them consistently wet is going to give you stretched, floppy plants that are going to be very soft, and when you pull them apart, they're just going to fall over. The optimum water is to look at the bottom of the container and make sure that you're drying down to at least a level 2 at the bottom. If you get to a level 3, you might say, well, let's come back. At the top, it could be a 2, but if the bottom gets to a 2, that's good, because remember, tomatoes are very drought tolerant. And actually, if you get them drier, you're going to get a little bit faster truss formation. So, Bill, do you know what a truss is?
Well, I know what a truss is in architecture. Tell me what it is in plants.
It's what holds the tomato fruits and the
Okay.
flowers and the fruits. So you really want, your goal in the tomato production is to get that truss expressed as fast as possible, because when the consumer comes in and sees tomatoes with trusses on them, they go, I'm going to have tomatoes pretty soon, right?
Yep.
If you have a tall, stretchy little thing, they're kind of going like, what am I going to do? I'm going to have to stake it when I first get it. It's the problem. So really look at making sure that you dry them down. If you overstress them, you can affect fruit set. So basically, early dry down is okay. Later dry down is kind of a problem. It's really important to make sure that you firm the soil down in and around the plug when you plant them. And to achieve that, what we'd like to do is to have that angled water nozzle that, as the plugs go through, it pushes the soil up against the plug so that you water them in. When you look at your moisture management program, remember, water that in, especially if you're using large containers, to just below the plug. So you don't have to, when you first transplant them and then put them down in the greenhouse, you don't have to soak the soil to the bottom of the container, because that's just going to give you wet soil. You want to basically put on enough water so that the plug where the plug is, that layer where the plug is wet. And then over time, as the roots start to develop, then you start watering to the bottom. If we take a look at the 5 levels of moisture, level 5 through level 1, you can really see where the roots are optimized. When you have a level 5 consistently, you just don't have roots. That's because they don't need to grow, because there's plenty of water everywhere. When you have a level 4, you get some roots, but it's really when you get down and rotating between a level 2 and a level 3 that you really start getting good root growth. When you start getting to so that it's level 1 at the top, where it's basically you can blow on it and the soil blows away, you don't have quite as good a root system as you do if you have a level 2, level 3. So really train your growers to pick the plants up, bend over, pick the plants up, and if the bottoms are wet, especially early on, don't water them. Make sure that you run them dry. That'll keep them more compact. So another thing that we've seen over the years, and this is some work that Bill Argo did, is when you feed, if you feed initially in the plug stage before you plant them, we talked about this, feeding them just as they're coming up onto the transplant line. So it's just as a pre-plant. and the first week may be sufficient to give you a saleable plant. Notice that this is the begonias, but we've seen this with literally all of the annuals that we've worked with over the years. A good solid pre-plant treatment, which we recommended earlier in the presentation, and then if necessary, you could do it again at day 14, gives you a full plant that is very marketable. Just adding more feed later in the crop cycle really doesn't do anything more than just give you bigger plants that you then have to put growth regulators or you have to do other things to try to keep them under control. Since there's so few growth regulators that are allowed for tomatoes, you really have to be working with the fertilizer to keep the plants compact. So really be thinking about what can I do to minimize growth through my fertilizer program. If, for example, though, you do have slow leaf expansion, the plants just don't fill out, put a little bit of ammonia plus phosphorus, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, to promote that leaf expansion. If you have a lot of soft growth, excessive leaf expansion, stretching, you really have got to eliminate that fertilizer after planting, because what that plant is telling you is we got enough feed in this soil that we don't need extra feed as the crop matures. If you have to feed, it's better to use less more often than a lot at one time. Because if you put on, let's say, less than 150 parts per million, so anywhere 50, 100 parts per million, a couple of times, that gives you controlled growth. If you go and put on 200 parts per million or more, and there's a lot of fertilizer in the soil, those plants, especially the tomatoes, will take off on you, and you just can't get them under control again, except under use of excessive amounts of growth regulators, which add costs, add inconvenience, and can affect the eventual yields for these consumers. One thing you may want to consider doing is feeding at shipping at the time you ship the plants with, say, 150 to 200 parts per million, so that while they're going through retail, they don't go hungry, and that the consumer then, when they buy them, that they've got a plant that's got some nutrients in them so that they're a success. Because as we know, consumers are not really big on applying a lot of fertilizer. And with tomatoes, they are very sensitive to yield and fertilizer. The more you fertilize them, the more they are the yield. So let's just talk about fertilizer just a moment, because it's so critical in deciding, am I doing the right thing for my crop? Always start out with an annual water test. The water test will tell you where you are and what you need to be doing when you add your fertilizer and how it will impact the soil pH. Water alkalinity starting at 100 to 200 parts per million is a sweet spot in growing good quality plants. If you have higher than 200, you may have to add some acid to get it back down to 200. If it's below 100, well, that means that you're going to have to use a different fertilizer, because you don't want to drop the pH anymore, because that'll cause additional problems. You also want to know what's in that water. What is the water nutrition? So that you can know that what fertilizer should I add? Is there some in there? Do I have to add some more? And then look at what is the pH and EC. Is it within the normal range? And then, of course, we always talk about the media pH, so that is it at 5.8 to 6.2? Because when you put that combination of alkalinity of 100 to 200 parts per million, the right pH and EC, and nutrients, then all of that works perfectly when the soil pH is 5.8 to 6.2. When we look at the fertilizer, remember that early feed is critical to load the soil and get the plants going, and using less than 150 parts per million. Remember, high ammonia levels give you soft growth, give you big floppy leaves. Whereas if you use ammonia and phosphorus, then you end up with very stretched plants. So let's just talk a moment about the use of the different fertilizer formulations, because there's a million of them out there. But let's take a look at them and make sure that you look at the label, and let's just see what happens. Remember that if you use a fertilizer that's high in ammonia and high phosphorus, it tends to be more acidic reacting, and it will lower the pH of the soil, which can be a problem with tomatoes. If you have all nitrate feed, or a heavy nitrate formulation of nitrogen, then and a low pH, then low phosphorus, and the pH tends to rise. So let's take a look at a couple different fertilizer formulations: 20-20-20, 20-10-20, 17-5-17, and a bunch of low phosphorus feeds. over on the right-hand side. What I've done is I basically looked at what is the amount of phosphorus in these different fertilizers and what is the amount of phosphorus and ammonia. So if we take a look at, say, 2020, 74% of the nitrogen in that 150 parts per million is ammonia fertilizer. And 2020 has urea in it and has ammonia nitrate in it. And so that the rest of the other 26% is a nitrate feed plus the phosphorus. So, Bill, do you think those plants are going to stretch much when you're putting on 2020?
Yeah, they're going to get out of control.
Totally out of control. And because you're really limited in what you can do with growth regulators, this is a problem. So if you find that you've got a lot of stretch, really you have to stand back and say, okay, so what fertilizer should we use? Well, let's take a look at all the way over on the right-hand side where we're looking at those fertilizers that are, say, 13-213 or 15-015. Notice that the 13-213, which has 7% of ammonia, a little bit of ammonia, that's good because it'll give you a little bit of leaf expansion, a little bit of stretch. It'll keep the plants a little bit greener. And notice that it only has 10 parts per million phosphorus at 150 parts per million. So you basically are getting the benefit of having phosphorus. So you don't have purple foliage. And it also gives you some ammonia. Do read the labels very carefully because some of the 15015s are used some urea phosphate or urea, I'm sorry, not urea phosphate, but just urea, or they have ammonia nitrate in them. So they could have a little bit more ammonia in them, but if nothing else, they have no phosphorus in them so that you're not going to see the stretch. I bring in the micronutrients of iron, manganese, and boron. So ideally, the recommended rate is about 1 part per million iron, 1 part per million manganese, and about a half part per million boron is the recommended amount that you should be applying every time you fertilize. Notice that the different formulations at 150 parts per million are a little bit shy on those numbers. So if you are seeing problems where you have a lot of chlorosis, even though you're fertilizing, you might be seeing an iron manganese deficiency. If you're seeing tip abortions, you might be having a boron deficiency. So therefore, you're going to have to add an additional supplemental micronutrient package from STEM or have a custom formulation mixed up if you buy enough fertilizer to basically address the micronutrient needs of the plant. But really look at your fertilizer program, especially when you're starting to say, am I putting on too much growth regulators? Am I getting too much stretch? Am I not getting enough stretch? So, the fertilizers can make a huge difference in what happens in your crop. Let's shift gears and talk about light, photoperiod, and temperature because these really impact how fast those plants grow and what you end up with. Remember, high intensity lighting of 4,000 to 6,000 foot candles instantaneous in the middle of the day is excellent. 14 to 20 DLI, the more light, the better the growth. High light intensity, you reduce the number of leaves to the first truss. So if you have low light conditions, the first truss, which is where the fruit is going to be significantly delayed. So you really want to highlight to accelerate faster flowering. So make sure that you put them in the brightest locations you can. These are really high light plants. You really want to avoid that low light conditions, and that just ends up with nothing but stretching and delayed flowering. If you've got LED lights, do know what LED light quality you're using. Blue light has been shown to keep the plants more compact, whereas just red or low UV basically it is not as effective as just blue light. So using the high UV light. So basically looking at what are you using can be used to help keep the plants under control if you don't want to use growth regulators. Let's talk a little bit about flowering. Tomato is a day neutral plant. And so there's about 6 to 11 leaves have to unfold before you get the first truss of flowers. So, of course, rate of leaf unfolding is a function of temperature, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The truss is terminal, meaning that you basically unfold X number of leaves, and then you end up with a truss, and then it branches right there at the truss. So if you have a determinate variety, and of course all tomatoes are classified as determinate or indeterminate. So if you have a determinate type, they tend to be bushy. And what happens is you get a lot of lateral branches coming out. My grandma used to always tell us, break all those branches off, which was made a lot of sense. Basically, when you had indeterminate tomato varieties, which just kept going up and up and up and up and didn't branch a lot. So removing a couple of those side branches, that was a good thing. But if you have a determinate variety, you want those branches to come out. You want to get enough fertilizer to get those to come out, because then you'll end up with more fruit. Most of the varieties for consumers are determinate, um, um, and that you basically are indeterminate and you get better branching. So average daily temperature controls rate of leaf unfolding. Um, 50 degrees is the base temperature. Remember, the base temperature is where plants don't grow anymore. So if you're running at 50 degrees, the plants are not going to be growing. So basically, this is a very warm-blooded plant. So keeping the soil temperature 68 to 72 is really essential for very rapid growth. So if you're trying to turn these fast, basically get that temperature up. Getting an air temperature of 68 to 75, it helps promote better compact growth. Remember that there's some very critical temperature for various developmental features. If you're just trying to grow vegetative growth, as you're at 45 degrees, the plants are not going to grow. An optimum of 65 to 77, perfect. If you're trying to get flowering, notice that flowering is basically at 55 to 60 degrees. Fruit set is a little bit different if you're trying to get fruiting, so that you do have a bunch of different temperatures. Take a look at for controlling the stretch, because remember, as I mentioned, you don't have a lot of growth regulators that you can use. Excessive feeds give you excessive leaf expansion. High ammonia and phosphorus, you get a lot of leaf and stem expansion. Nitrate fertilizers, 14014, they help promote toned plants. Some growers will use just potassium nitrate. There's some growers that suffer from a lot of phosphorus deficiency. We use potassium phosphate as their only fertilizer, and this will keep the plants more compact, but that's more advanced growers that have a lot of tomatoes that they're trying to produce. The average person is just going to use like a 13-2-13 or 15-0-15. But remember, diff is your first line of control. If you use diff, you can successfully keep those plants under control. Remember, it's the day minus the night temperature. So as soon as you start getting high day temperatures, so growers will have their Quonset greenhouses closed up, and then when they come out at break time or sometime, they open it up in the morning and they get this blast furnace coming out the doors. That's going to give you a maximum diff, and those plants are going to stretch. It's much better to get those doors open a little bit earlier so that the day temperature stays down early in the day and only rises late in the day. And when the sunlight is much brighter, which the sun will keep them compact, and then you don't have to worry as much about the diff. Now, growers will say, well, I don't have an expensive, fancy environmental controller, but just even using a day-night thermometer will help guide you as to what we should be doing from a day-night temperature. So you just basically come in and measure the high of the day, high temperature, and you look at the low temperature that the plants experience. You subtract that, and that will tell you about roughly what your diff is. This is about a hand grenade diff program where you at least give you some guidelines as to whether these plants are starting to stretch and you should start holding back water, or should you be changing your feed depending upon what you're trying to achieve. Remember, from a growth regulator, there's only one growth regulator that's labeled uniconazole, and it's really something that you want to use for early season, about 2 parts per million, and use diff. In late season, you may want to use multiple applications of uniconazole. The drench is not labeled, so you don't want to be putting drenches on that because that's outside of the label. Make sure that you really follow the instructions very carefully. Insects and diseases can be somewhat of a problem. Make sure that you're checking underneath the bench just as you are above the bench, and get those cards out so that you can really monitor what the insect population is. Whitefly is probably your number one problem. And you really want to monitor those adjacent crops because whiteflies are probably going to come in from something else that you had in your greenhouse. Thrips and mites can be also a problem. The caterpillar, there's a number of different caterpillars that can come in and wipe out a crop in short order. I've seen that myself. And also, you got to kind of watch out for aphids, especially as the temperatures warm up and your vents are open. You start sucking aphids into your greenhouse. Um, Disease risk. Now, that QR code over there basically is the QR code for a supplemental document on at risk crops. One of the most important things in tomato production is that you buy certified seed. What is certified seed? Certified seed has been tested to be free of specific virus and bacterial and fungal diseases. Time and again, we've got growers that basically say, I've got this incredible virus problem, or I've got this problem with bacterial blights on this variety, and you say, did you buy certified seed? Is your plug supplier using certified seed? If you're not using certified seed, oh well, you're basically rolling the die that you could have a disease problem. But certified seed, basically, it's tested, and it's tested to be free of the specific diseases that's specified. Virus risk is your number one problem. So you want to make sure that you're using seed that has been tested. A lot of bacterial problems are you basically avoid excessive cold or wet plants. Cold and wet plants are kind of bacterial and also extremely hot plants, but usually when you're finishing them in the spring, you don't have that many problems. There's a number of different blights, and this is again this warm, wet, high relative humidity conditions. And that's usually because you've watered late in the day or you're not ventilating. Ventilating is really important if you're doing a lot of tomatoes. Getting that air to move, getting those leaves moving, all help keep the plants compact and disease free. Watch out for the anthracnose and septoria and other foliar diseases. A lot of times that's low nutrition that basically makes the plants more susceptible and wet soil conditions. So at this point, Bill, are there any other resources that they could use to get more specific information?
Well, you mentioned the at risk content. I will put a link to that in the description and tag it at the end of the video. One of our ball seed technical specialists, Nick Flax, did a great video on tomato risks and risk management. So look for that link. And on the screen now, you can see 3 of the excellent guides from Grower Talks. We release our guides every other year, or in some cases, every year. And on here, you can see the insecticide, miticide, and fungicide guide, which is packed with charts and tables and the latest research on pest control strategies, the biosolutions guide, which is all about a holistic approach to IPM. It gives everything from biocontrol agents to biofungicides and bioinsecticides. And hot off the press is the plant growth regulator guide for annuals. Again, updated every other year and full of the latest products and strategies for PGRs. So you can find those at growertalks.com/grower guides for digital copies, or contact Ball Publishing and they will send you hard copies. In addition, you can find hundreds of tech on demand educational resources. We already referenced the at risk series that we've done. You can find that entire playlist on YouTube, Ball Seeds YouTube. Every week, I send a newsletter covering a range of cultural and technical topics. We've created hundreds of videos for greenhouse professionals of all skill levels. Some of these are great for training your production teams, and the podcast is an awesome way to learn about technical topics on the go. If you want to engage on social media, we have the Greenhouse Tech Team Facebook group. You can find that by searching Greenhouse Tech Team and answer a couple questions. I'll let you right into a dynamic group with more than 6,500 of your professional peers, and many other resources besides that. Will, thank you so much for your time. It's kind of fun to talk about a vegetable crop. I love the way that you positioned it for grower retailers, folks supplying independent
Mm-hmm.
garden centers, because you're right. We see very nice quality vegetable plants on the front apron of every big box store. They're lined up like little soldiers, but they tend to not have the variety of certainly tomatoes and peppers that you can produce on your own or buy from wholesalers specializing in IGCs. So I appreciate that. That's how we will position this video, is to help out the other part of the market, the other massive part of our market that
Hmm.
has an opportunity to really differentiate using vegetables like tomatoes. So again, thanks so much for your time, Will. We have a lot more on our to-do list, so I know that you're going to be back to share more tips and tricks before
Oh
too
yeah,
long, right?
absolutely.
Awesome. Well, I'm Bill Calkins with Tech on Demand, and on behalf of our entire team, thanks for listening and watching. Take care out there.